everyone. Welcome back to Mongabay's webinar series for journalists. I'm your host and moderator, Mike DiGirolamo, broadcasting to you from Gadigal land in the Eora Nation. This webinar is viewable on both YouTube and on LinkedIn, but I always recommend that you subscribe to Mongabay's YouTube channel so you can be notified when this webinar is edited after we're done here today. But you can also get notifications about our webinar series by subscribing to Mongabay's newsletter, which you can find a button to subscribe to in the upper right-hand corner at mongabay.com. So today's webinar topic is geoengineering, and while we're going to touch upon the field in general, we're going to heavily focus today on solar geoengineering, and there's lots to cover on just this subject alone. So that includes the science of solar geoengineering, the ethical divide on the subject, a global non-use agreement, and the social and governmental implications for deployment. And we may not get to every planned question we have today, but we will reserve some time at the end of our main panel for audience questions. So if you think of a question that you want to ask our panelists, go ahead and drop that in on the chat on YouTube or LinkedIn, and we're going to get to it at the end. So as a reminder, Mongabay is always seeking your pitches, and if you have a story idea, please send us your pitch under the appropriate special reporting project, which you can find on the opportunities page at mongabay.org. However, we always encourage you to pitch your story idea to other outlets if you're not going to pitch it to us. So with that out of the way, I'm just going to go ahead and briefly introduce our panelists, and we're going to jump straight into questions. And just, for everyone listening right now, if you miss any of this webinar, don't worry. It will be on demand on our YouTube channel after the broadcast and after it's edited. But our first panelist is Jeremy Hance. Jeremy is a writer and freelance environmental journalist who also happens to cohabitate with mental illness. He is the author of the memoir Baggage: Confessions of a Globetrotting Hypochondriac. As a journalist, Hance has cut his teeth at Mongabay beginning in 2009 and working as a lead writer and an editor for 6 years. And for over 3 years, he wrote the blog Radical Conservation at The Guardian. Today, he is a columnist for Mongabay, frequently covering the topic of geoengineering. And also joining us today is Jenny Stevens. Jenny is professor of climate justice at the Icarus Climate Research Centre at the National University of Ireland, Maynooth. She is a feminist climate justice scholar activist whose work explores how powerful actors and institutions obstruct climate action. And she is the author of the new book, Climate Justice and the University, Shaping a Hopeful Future for All. She was a 2023-2024 Climate Justice Fellow at Harvard-Radcliffe and was previously a professor at Northeastern University, University of Vermont, and Clark University. And lastly, also joining us is David Keith. David is professor of geophysical sciences and founding faculty director of the Climate Systems Engineering Initiative at the University of Chicago. He's best known for his work on the science, technology, and public policy of solar geoengineering. He led the development of Harvard's Solar Geoengineering Research Program before moving to Chicago in 2023, and he is the author of over 200 academic publications, many public op-eds, and the book, A Case for Climate Engineering. So just to recap, we're going to give each panelist an opportunity to answer the questions that I pose, and then at the end of this hour-long panel or so, we're going to hold roughly a 15-minute Q&A session from audience questions as time allows. And you will, again, be able to view this webinar on demand on our YouTube channel after we're done here today. So let's go ahead and get started. So this is a pretty simple question, but what is geoengineering and what does it encompass? And what is not considered part of geoengineering? And anyone is welcome to go ahead and chime in.
I feel like, Dr. Keith, you should start with that.
I think you should. You guys are using the word that way. I don't typically use it in that overview way anyway. So you define it.
All right. Geoengineering is a method. I mean, I think in the stratospheric aerosol injection, which is what kind of the focus is today, it's a method to block out radiation from the sun, heat from the sun, in order to attempt to cool the planet. Geoengineering has sort of been a wide definition that I think is, I think importantly, is getting more slimmed down, and more focused on ways to basically mitigate climate change or mitigate the impacts, and through various means, but not including carbon dioxide removal, which is sort of been put in another basket.
Yeah, I would just say that it's generally refers to efforts to control or manipulate the Earth's systems. So whether it be the ocean or the atmosphere.
Yeah, I think that there's a part, as you said, that is typically about offsetting. So obviously, there's ways that humans manipulate the Earth system to some human end, like we've do all this nitrogen fertilizer by Haber-Bosch, so we have all these people on the planet, and that wasn't to try and restore or reduce some impact. It was basically making an impact to shape the Earth in human interest. And that's a kind of thing that humans might do with the climate, but at least what most of us are thinking about in most of the conversations about solar geoengineering anyway, and also carbon removal, is about attempting to reduce the human impacts on the Earth by doing something deliberately to the Earth. But the intent is to reduce the amount of climate change. At least that's sort of my intention. I think the intention of most folks working on it. I guess one minor thing is you said in your definition and then broadened it that it was about temperature. I think temperature is only one of a whole lot of variables. And indeed, in a day where we just had a big tropical cyclone or hurricane, it's worth saying that it's a very strong technical result that solar geoengineering is relatively more effective at reducing the intensity of tropical cyclones than it is at reducing the intensity of the amount of temperature change in a proportional sense.
Okay. Good responses. So we're going to go ahead and move on to our next question. Now, this doesn't necessarily, we'll get to solar geoengineering in a minute, but what are the overall concerns and critiques of geoengineering in general? And again, not just solar geoengineering, but the entire field.
So I can chime in there from a climate justice perspective. So I focus on justice and the inequities and disparities in the climate crisis. And from a climate justice perspective, we think about climate change not as the problem, but as a symptom of a much larger problem, which is the extractive systems, economic and financial systems that are creating and perpetuating and worsening inequities of all kinds, right? So when one of the things that solar or geoengineering is representative of is this very narrow climate isolationist perspective, which is thinking about climate change as like this narrow problem that we need to fix, rather than recognizing that it's a bigger systemic problem that we need large transformative systemic change to address. So from my perspective, geoengineering is very dangerous because it has all kinds of unintended consequences. It represents almost the worst of like the arrogance of Western science that we can somehow fix the problem. And we know that we do not have a functioning international governance system. So there's no way that this could actually be deployed in a way that is fair and just. So I think it's very dangerous to be perpetuating and promoting this technically optimistic view that somehow we don't have to have big transformative change to address the climate crisis and the root causes of it.
So that's from my perspective, somewhat of a caricature. It's a very effective caricature, but certainly isn't my view. And I think it's not the view of most people working in the field. So I don't think there's any chance we address the climate crisis without some transformational change. The climate crisis, we've got to where we've got because of the power of entrenched interests, fossil fuel-rich nations and fossil-driven companies that have blocked action. And I think addressing that requires a kind of political change at a bunch of levels, up to levels involving a kind of developing new tools of planetary governance to make choices about things like climate. And that's true with or without solar geoengineering. So certainly, I personally don't imagine this is some magic technical fix and don't see it as particularly optimistic. Obviously, that's not, different people have different perspectives, but I'm just telling you how I think. When I think about some of the risks and problems, I'd say they come in a bunch of chunks. So there's a whole series of physical risks, climate hazards, from even a kind of relatively well-intentioned deployment. So, you're most obviously you're adding aerosols to the atmosphere. We know aerosols kill people. It's a much bigger killer than climate change right now. That's probably the very first one thinks about, but there's an enormous number more. Ozone loss, iodine from sea salt spray changes methane lifetimes, et cetera. The basic issue that this might make climate change worse in some places, accidents, et cetera. Then there's a set of justice concerns. To say a little more about what they are, I sort of see them in a couple of big lumps. There's a distributive justice concern, which is both for climate and if there was solar geoengineering, it's what the actual distribution of impacts is, who is benefited and who's harmed. And then there's these procedural justice questions that Jenny's referring to, that we don't have a system of making global decisions like this in a way that is procedurally just according to ways that I would subscribe to, or Jenny would. And there's a set of things related to moral hazard, the idea that this may be politically exploited by groups that want to block action on climate by overstating how well solar geoengineering could work and attempt to keep business as usual. And there's a kind of collective addiction. There's worries about conflict. And then there's bigger issues about interaction with humanity and nature and what it means for humans to be more in control of the Earth system. So I think there's a big range of sort of complicated issues in many different buckets.
Jeremy, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that was well put on both sides. I think that frames sort of the challenges that geoengineering as sort of this nascent idea that is legitimately should be scary and is scary, but also at the same time, climate change is scary too, and what are we going to do about it? So I think that sort of brings in the focus of the debate that I found when I was doing the reporting on this, of where people are sort of trying to figure out the best way forward. And that debate really centers, just a second, that's the debate really just centers around, right now, around research. No one is really talking about deployment on a large scale at this point. It's really about whether or not we study this in the field, I think is what again, my journalism has found. So we're not talking about actually doing this at this point. There might be some people out there who think it's a good idea. I think most people would be a little horrified by it, but for the most part, we're talking about whether or not we should be pushing forward and researching this in the field.
I think it's important to be careful about assuming what most people think. I know I'm really terrible at doing that based on what people around me think. If I looked at what people around me think, I'd be completely confident that Harris would win in a massive landslide, but that's probably not what's going to happen. And to the extent that we have polling data, it tells us something different than just the other people we talk to. And to the extent that we have polling data about this, which we do, it suggests that there's actually quite a lot more support even for deployment than you might think, and that support is concentrated in the developing world.
So we're going to go ahead and move on to our next question. So civil society organizations have raised concerns and evidence of lobbying for geoengineering on behalf of fossil fuel companies like ExxonMobil. As a journalist, Jeremy, do you have any more insight into this? What are some things that journalists should be keeping in mind when looking into who is funding and who is promoting geoengineering?
Well, as far as I could see, I don't think I didn't see any real funding from fossil fuels at this point. I think most scientists who are working on this would be loath to take money from fossil fuels to research this. In fact, the governments are starting, the U.S. government has started to put a little money into different types of carbon dioxide removal, geoengineering ideas. So, but the lobbying idea, I think, raises one of the large concerns, which is that by even talking about geoengineering, we're sort of giving fossil fuel companies, the industry, more license to do what they've been doing. I think that's a legitimate concern. I think that's something that needs to be talked about. I'm a little skeptical just because I feel like fossil fuel companies are doing what they're doing anyway, and I don't think I don't see them like that this is going to, I think in some ways this is such a big move that it may actually have the opposite. It may kind of wake people up to how large of an issue this is. I would say where fossil fuel companies are really putting money and interest is much more in carbon dioxide removal. That's where at least there's been a lot of lobbying at the climate talks and things like that. That's where they, but I obviously down the road, that could change.
I think it's not obvious when you say it gives them or we give them a license. I think to me that doesn't exactly get the way I think about the politics is like on the environmental left, we want to transition away from fossil fuels quickly, and people have different ideas about exactly how much. And to be clear, we're making progress. Emissions are down in North America and Europe, and there's this, now 1.75% of the entire economy devoted to clean energy, which is a stunning, impressive fact that wasn't true 5 years ago with giant build-outs of wind and solar. And so there's a way in which I think the tide's beginning to turn, and the forces of anti-fossil forces are at least, I wouldn't say winning, but a lot more winning than we were 10 years ago. It really feels very different. And that's because of environmental action. It didn't happen because fossil fuel companies woke up wanting to be green. It happened in response to pressure by environmental activists. And so it's not as if environmental activists will reduce the pressure on fossil fuel companies because geoengineering exists if it does. So I think you need to, I'm not saying there's not a problem. I think there is, but you need to pick apart the politics of what that problem is, because it's not as if those of us, I suspect all of us on this call, although we disagree about some things, will all want to see much more action to restrain fossil fuels really quickly. And none of us would want to give them, release that if geoengineering happened, whether or not we want it to happen.
Yeah, and I would just chime in here. I've been working on climate and energy in universities with research for over 30 years. And the influence of the fossil fuel industry on what our universities study and what we focus on in our climate and energy research is huge. We just have a new paper out documenting that. For decades of strategic investment, the fossil fuel companies have been investing in our universities. And they have been focusing on these technical fixes, as Jeremy said, a lot about carbon capture and storage. But what that has done, it has displaced academic research in the bigger transformative social changes that we need, because most of our climate energy research in our universities is focused on, it brings this climate isolationism view that I mentioned at the beginning, that is very narrow and thinking just about climate as a problem that we need to fix with a technical perspective. And it has prevented all kinds of research that we could and should be doing in our universities about how do we phase out fossil fuels? What kinds of international governance structures would get us to fossil fuel phase out. And I would disagree with David when he says we've made good progress. Fossil fuel companies are making more money, and fossil fuel production and extraction is actually going up. So although we may have made progress in some particular places in the world, if you take a global perspective, we have not made progress. It's the opposite. And most of our climate policy has been co-opted by fossil fuel interests. And very powerful and wealthy, rich elites are the ones who are continuing to perpetuate this idea that we're making progress, and we're not. And I think a lot of the tech billionaires are the ones who are funding geoengineering, and they're funding our universities to study geoengineering in the same way that fossil fuel companies have funded our universities to study carbon capture and storage. So we are in this power play of our universities and our research agendas being co-opted by powerful interests and not focusing on actually what the public good and for climate justice. If we want a climate just future, what would we be doing research on in our universities? It's not geoengineering and it's not carbon capture and storage.
That's an assertion that it's not geoengineering, but it's not an argument. And I think my view is in a climate just world, we would be doing research on it. And I'm happy to give you reasons why I think that's true. But I think it's important to say, I agree that there's too much corporate power in universities. And I agree there's been a lot of corruption. I've seen some of it face to face myself. That's part of why I left UCalgary. We had a fight with direct corruption by oil industry of university operations. I had like a hidden tape and a fight on the national radio about it. So I totally agree, but I don't think that is the same as saying that if we had a more climate just world, we wouldn't do research on solar geoengineering. That might be true. Obviously, that's Jenny's position, but you have to actually make a concerted argument why that's true. I think with regard to whether we're making progress, I'd like to make a lot more progress than we are, but I think we are making progress. Having this level of growth of climate and of solar and wind, as well as of electric vehicles, I'll turn it around in another way. That, I mean, you may not buy any of this, Jenny, but I agree that fossil fuel industry is powerful, but I live partly in Alberta, which is very fossil dominated, has a hideous fossil dominated government. But I also know lots of young people through my children's kids and so on. And it's pretty clear when I look at the young people that people do not think that industry will live. That as much as they're blustering, they can see the writing on the wall. And I think you're right, emissions are going up, but they're going up slowly. And I'll put a bet that this decade emissions peaks.
We do need to move on to our next question. So thank you, panelists, for chiming in on that one. So as mentioned in the intro of this webinar, we are going to focus largely on solar geoengineering and stratospheric aerosol injection. So let's go ahead and address the scientific divide, the ethical divide on the deployment of solar geoengineering. So in a nutshell, what's the split here, for and against? What are the potential benefits versus the potential harms to our ecosystems? Why would we even consider doing something like this, and why not?
So I'll put it in just as a journalist, try and put it in really quick terms, then I'd love to hear the other panelists. But basically, why we would do it is it has the potential to cool the Earth, over time. You'd have to keep doing it. It would basically involve flights that would release some kind of, probably sulfur dioxide, but some kind of material to reflect back some sunlight. You potentially then can cool the Earth over a period of time, basically buying us some extra time to make some of the larger scale long-term changes that we need. Why would we consider this? Because, at least from my point of view, we've waited too long to really get emissions down and to preserve the climate that we've inherited. And so that is, I think, the reason why this is even being considered. But I do want to say that I don't think we're talking really about deployment yet. We're talking about research. So I think that's where the divide, at least in my reporting, focused on was whether or not we should be even researching this, not so much on whether or not we should be doing this, because the first step would be actually researching it.
Jenny, David?
I can say something about what I think are your question was about the ethics of deployment, and it's so complicated. I don't have a simple answer. It depends. In some ways, I don't think it depends who does it and how it's deployed. So on a purely ethical basis, forgetting it, if it was done by if there was some globally just regime where there was some mass democratic global system without state power to make decisions, and that system decided to do it, then presumably it would be ethical. I don't think there's a kind of built-in ethics to a technology. It depends on how it's used. So I can easily think of extremely unethical ways to use it and ethical ways to use it. I don't have a general answer to whether deployment is ethical or not. I don't think there is one.
I guess I would say from a climate justice perspective, there isn't really a way to deploy in an equitable way, right? Like the unintended consequences, the potential disruption of our Earth systems in ways that the models can't predict is such that it's really dangerous. And we could could have all kinds of impacts ecologically to hydrologic systems, to our food systems. It could cause, all kinds of disruptions that are very hard to predict. And depending on who has control, the manipulation could, be more beneficial to some parts of the world or some discrete areas and cause real harm and much worse climate impacts in other areas. So again, there's no way for this that I see, and for everything that I understand about the possibilities here, for it to be deployed in a way that is just and equitable and that it benefits everybody. There would definitely be some places that wouldn't benefit, right? So I think that's where I think it's really, really dangerous to be promoting it as this idea and getting to the research question. The other big, obvious, major risk and harm is the governance. We can see in the world right now that even with big international human rights law and international law that supposedly everyone around the world is held to, that isn't the case. Powerful countries can turn a blind eye and let horrible things happen if they want to. So we do not have a global governance system that makes this at all possible to ever be a positive from my perspective. So I think it's really, really dangerous. And I think that's where it's not harms versus benefits. It's like, actually, there's no way for me to even imagine how this could possibly be a positive. And so I think that's why it's dangerous to be considering this drastic set of ideas.
This conversation, I think, is mixing up two things, kind of procedural and distributive justice questions. So one set of questions is so Jenny implied that it was sort of impossible to do it unless everybody benefited, if anybody's harmed. I think any large-scale action is going to harm some people. That would be true even in a world with perfect justice because of the inherent uncertainty. So if you think about vaccines are wonderful, but they do actually harm a very tiny number of people. There are lots of things we do with societies, even just societies, where there are going to be public policy decisions that could be done in a idealized just society that are still going to harm some people. The threshold for making decisions isn't that nobody's harmed. The threshold, there's two sets. There's a set of procedural justice questions about the equity of who gets to vote, where I think we'd all agree that people should have equal votes independent of how much money they have, and a bunch of different things we should agree about the procedure for making a decision. But even if you had a perfect procedure to making a decision, practical decisions we'd actually make as humans are not going to ever pass the threshold of benefiting everybody. So all sorts of decisions you make are going to have some benefits and risks, and benefits and risks do matter and should matter in making decisions, at least in the way I understand public policy. So to me, there's really two kinds of questions. One is, what are the what is the likelihood that people would be harmed and benefit from this? And the other question is how the decision is made. And I don't think we know the science perfectly, but on the other hand, we have the science we have. And the science we have very strongly suggests that solar geoengineering done in a way that is balanced across the hemispheres and relatively small has very wide benefits. That's true from every climate model we've looked at. It's not just temperature, but it's extreme precipitation and water availability and sea level rise, many of the climate hazards we know. Of course, it could be that all those models are wrong. But on the other hand, if that's true, we got to ask how confident we are about cutting CO2 emissions, because they're the same models. It's the same integrated piece of climate science. And if we believe that climate science knows something with uncertainties and imperfections, then I think we need to take into account what that science says when we make decisions, which is separate from the question of what is the justice pathway to make those decisions.
Jeremy, do you have anything to add?
No, I think I think viewers are getting sort of the sense of how thorny and difficult this is at this point.
So I'm going to go ahead and move on to our next question. So according to some experts, there's risk that comes from simply researching it. So how significant of a risk is the research in comparison to deployment, and what do journalists need to pick apart here?
I think a lot of the assumption of the risk around research is this assumption of that talking about it, that considering it, that mulling it over is going to be bad. I think the actual risk of we're talking about small scale research projects. I can give an example of one off Alameda, which in California, which was looking at trying to do cloud brightening, and they were just spraying salt water into the air and trying to measure it. That got canceled because it was connected to a geoengineering idea, so the local government shut it down. Was that experiment of using seawater and spraying in air risky? No. And even the ones that would involve a small amount of sulfur, I think in the stratosphere, potentially looking at what would happen. I don't view that as personally risky. I mean, the volcanoes put 20 million tons of sulfur into the atmosphere every year. So we're talking about small research. I think the fear is, and the real concern and the real debate is around, would research then lead to deployment? And that is where I think there's a number of activists, people who believe we should not have research in the field. I mean, that let me be clear here. At least from what I understand, the groups that I've talked to, research on computers in laboratory settings is fine, but research in the field gives them pause because they feel that that's going to lead to a deployment. And I think that's where the question really lies. The research itself, on the scales we're talking, I don't see that as having any kind of planetary risk.
One kind of high level way to think about it is in a kind of the most simplistically kind of 2x2 matrix that we in the current world think geoengineering works or doesn't. Of course, it doesn't really work or not work. It's fuzzy and messy on both sides. Nothing ever works without a bunch of problems. And no environmental fixes ever work cleanly. In that sense, they're not fixes and so on. But let's just assume there's a kind of extreme case of it really works or doesn't. And there's where we think it works or doesn't. And let's say in 2050, we find out more whether it works or doesn't. So you can think of a kind of a simple 2x2 matrix. And I think the thing that everybody worries about that's related to the moral hazard concern, but not quite the same, is that we are overconfident, that we think it works now. And maybe then we then kind of act based on that, maybe not cutting emissions as quickly as we might. In introducing this, Jeremy mentioned this buys time. I hate that framing because buys time basically implies that you're going to slow down emissions cuts, which wouldn't be my vote. And then we find out in 2050 what happens. And the big worry is that we think it works and it doesn't. I think it's a completely legitimate worry. But don't forget the other case. The other case is that we're so confident that it doesn't work that we forgo the chance to use this to buy a huge amount of environmental and human protection that we can't buy any other way. And that's also a real possibility. And I think in thinking about the risk of research, I think it's important to bear in mind that the coin has two sides. That there really is a possibility that people look back from 2050, let's say we don't use it, and people look back and say, man, we had a huge amount of prejudice that meant that there were never decisions to use this. And yet if we had used it retrospectively, it wouldn't have been perfect. There would have buld been side effects, but we would have actually saved a lot of lives in the millions. That's not a made up number, and reduced ecosystem impacts a lot.
Yeah, well, I see the risks of doing research in a different way, I guess. The risks of a lot of funding and research in our most prestigious academic institutions in the world focused on this, it also displaces doing research on other things that would more definitely lead to healing and transformative change and bigger picture change. And this gets to the point of thinking again narrowly about climate change as like this thing that we need to fix. So we have to focus on research on that rather than stepping back and looking at the world and seeing it's not just climate change. We have all kinds of other challenges that are, many people are using the word polycrises, right? It's not just climate change. We have multiple crises and they're all interconnected. And so when we focus our research narrowly on one and on this kind of narrow perspective that we can somehow fix one problem and then leave everything else to, go to hell or whatever happens with everything else. Like it's just such a waste of the resources. Like I know some big philanthropists are funding solar geoengineering research, and David would know more who and how much, but I know Bill Gates is one of them. And like, I just imagine, what if they put all that money and effort into fossil fuel phase out and transformative changes that would make it so we're not getting worse and worse and worse every year. And so that's one of the risks of the research that I see, is that it takes up all the oxygen, right? Our climate research is on this. Like, that isn't what we need, you know? The other big risk of research is that the people who are advocating for research are the researchers. And we know that if you look at the Oppenheimer movie that many of us watched, Oppenheimer manages this huge big research initiative. And then once the thing is developed, he hands it over to the military and he says, "Oh, keep us updated. How does it go?" You know, and they say to him, "Your job is done. You have no control anymore." And that we seem to miss in all of these conversations that are dominated by the people who are doing the research, that have all these lofty ideas of how it could be great, it could help us, it could really save lives, without understanding or reckoning with the risk and the danger of developing a technology and then handing it over to the military or whoever, some authoritarian government, who is just going to run with it, which we know they will, because why wouldn't you? Because we have no international governance system that would stop it. So like, that's where the danger is there. And to continue to say, "Oh, but the benefits might be more than the risks," is like, no, I don't think so. Like, from my perspective, that just is not, it's not a benefit risk thing. It's like catastrophic and potential for big and this sense that somehow there's this imaginary global governance world where this could be done in a safe and effective way, I think is not acknowledging the world that we live in and the people who are in charge, which is powerful actors and authoritarian governments.
We're going to go ahead and
but I think you need to say who you're talking about. So you've just said that those of us working on this just narrowly think that this is this magic solution, everything else can fail, and that we're thinking this very academic way. That was one thing you said. Another one is this idea that we're really that so much money displaces other work. So speaking for myself, I've spent a lot of time in developing countries, in India, spent a week there last year talking to a bunch of researchers, in Pakistan, in Indonesia. I spent a lot of time talking with leaders in the developing world. So I don't think I'm unaware that I'm certainly not in charge, and this is going to get run in a chaotic real world. That's a thing I've been worried about since I started working on this 20 years ago or 30 years ago. So I certainly, speaking for myself, but my impression is my colleagues don't have some naive idea that it all works smoothly. Every conversation that I'm part of in the geoengineering research community thinks about these problems. So I think Jenny's kind of making a caricature of the way the geoengineering research community is, which doesn't reflect my actual experience being in that community. I think it just isn't empirically close to true that the amount of money in here is significantly displacing anything else. So the total amount of money for climate research total is about 10 billion a year. The amount of money for climate solutions research that's globally is many times higher than that. The kinds of money that are now flowing to solar geoengineering research is a few tens of millions a year. So tiny fraction of this. Even on this campus, UChicago, where we have this big initiative, it's the amount of money flowing to this is tiny or small compared to other research on climate. And that research absolutely is dealing with climate in a multidimensional way. I'm sure not exactly the way Jenny wants, but it is just not the case that me and people like me and other folks at UChicago are thinking about this as a kind of simple, it just checks the box and we can forget about everything else. That's just not empirically what the conversations are. So I feel like that is sort of, to be blunt, kind of attacking a straw dog. Like if we really were thinking about that, it'd be a totally legitimate attack, but it just isn't the way people are actually, and you can look at that in people's papers and what happens in meetings and so on. So just to say, I agree that there's a danger it'll be misused, but you need to think empirically about what the likelihood of misuse is and about how the political games might actually be played by people in power to get an outcome. And that's true for all sorts of technologies, not just this one.
Right. We do need to move on to our next question because we have quite a few more to get through. So in 2021, Indigenous groups and environmentalists alike, including from the Sami Council and 30 different Indigenous organizations, stood in opposition to Harvard University's SCoPEx project, the Stratospheric Controlled Perturbation Experiment, in regards to testing and SAI research. So this might be mainly a civil society question, but how do you feel these concerns were covered in the media?
Well,
I think.
No. Go ahead.
Yeah, Jenny. No, Jenny, you go ahead. I think you have more expertise on that part.
No, I mean, it seems to me that the media coverage tends to be quite optimistic, and that the concerns of many, many, many social movements, feminist communities, indigenous communities, climate justice advocates around the world are not often acknowledged and recognized. Most with these other concerns don't necessarily have a lot of funding to work on this full time and talk to media, and there isn't, again, there's this. I see an imbalance in media coverage that tends to adopt a kind of climate is a problem. How can we fix it? Here's a new potential technology that I think doesn't adequately represent all the breadth of concerns and the different kinds of knowledge that Indigenous perspectives in particular bring, which are based on reciprocity and honoring the earth systems and not trying to control the earth systems, and moving in a totally opposite direction from trying to engineer the earth systems even more than and disrupt the natural earth systems even more than we already have. So I think those voices have not been adequately or representatively presented in the media, and it's often seems to be presented as, there's this idea is getting mainstreamed and normalized, whereas in the spaces where I and the communities and the climate justice advocacy world, this is very, very much a fringe idea that is a lot of people are very afraid of it. And I don't think those voices are getting in a lot of the mainstream coverage about it.
It's very, again, back to my quip about the fact that if I just looked at my friends, I'd think that Harris was going to win. It's very hard to know what people think from what media coverage says. I want to say a little bit about some of what we know from polling. So there's a couple different ones. There's Masa Sugiyama did a poll of young people in Asian countries, both some more developed and poorer countries. Astrid Dannenberg did a big poll of climate negotiators. And Ben Silvercole did a much larger systematic kind of global poll. And all of those things suggest that there's actually really broad support for research on this topic among general public. And that it's stronger in the developing world and the more climate vulnerable world. So there's now enough papers that I think that's a kind of a robust result. So it's not disagreeing with what Jenny said. There's certainly, I totally buy that in the social connections that Jenny has, everybody's very worried and thinks it's a bad thing, and they might be right. But in the larger world that neither of us are in, that's the world if you just go randomly ask humans, I think there's much more support. And I think that's not reflected very much in journalism. So I see a lot of journalism where they'll interview a few people like me, and they'll interview, some of the very prominent scientists who really don't think this research should happen, like Pierre Humbert, who's a fantastic, amazing person, but his view is really an outlier, and we know that empirically. For example, there was a paper that randomly selected IPCC authors in the US, and every single one of them supported research of the 12 that we looked at, 13 that we looked at. So I think maybe I see it the opposite of Jenny's. I think, in fact, that reporting doesn't do a very good job reflecting where, in fact, the main body of opinion lies, which doesn't mean it's right. Sometimes there's a majority opinion that's wrong, but it doesn't do a good job reflecting where the main body of opinion lies.
As a reporter, I will say, when I was doing the work on a number of stories, I was surprised just that the polling was the way it was. I think the one thing that we don't really know is just how much of this information is getting to people and how well people understand what's being talked about.
Yep.
I think that, and that's a problem for us journalists to try, and anybody to try and educate people about what. Like, there's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of kind of not great arguments on both sides of this issue. And so I do think that is one of the things. But I was surprised at the polling. And I think, honestly, that goes more, that says something about just how bad the climate crisis is for people living in places like India. The heat that they are feeling, and the changes that they are seeing, that we in the West with air conditioning and stuff are maybe less feeling. I mean, I still feel like it's insanely hot here in October, but I think a lot of people just doesn't register in the same way as it would be in certain parts of the world.
I think that's one piece of it. I think another reason that attitudes about this have changed is science. That there has been now 20 years of really active research on this topic, after sort of 20 years of very slow research, and there's thousands of papers published, and really all sorts of climate modeling groups around the world have looked at this, and lots of people with a healthy bias to find problems. And I think what we found is the problems are quantitatively much smaller than we thought. Like, I published all these papers 15 years ago saying, yeah, you can cool the global temperature, you're going to make some areas much worse off. And that's not actually what we see in the climate models. Again, maybe the climate models are wrong. We're trying to look for reasons for how they might be wrong. But I think part of the changing view about this is this accumulation of results that affects, I think, the kind of elite climate scientists who then speak to media and so on, that it just objectively looks a lot better than we expect it to look, than I expect it to look, certainly.
So we're going to go ahead and move on to our next question. So Frank Bierman, who's a global sustainability governance professor, says that one of the main problems with geoengineering research is that it excludes social and governance issues from the equation. So we've talked about some of those, but what are the social and governance issues that SAI research and also its deployment excludes?
I just want to jump in. That statement is just nonsense. This is not him as an academic. This is him as an advocate. Come on. There are now papers that actually look at the breakdown of social science versus non-social science papers, and there's people who look at the breakdown of funding. So that statement, one of the problems with geoengineering research that excludes governance issues from the equation, is just bizarre. In fact, a big fraction of all papers on this topic have been about governance. So I think they may not produce a result that Frank wants, and Frank and I don't agree, but as an empirical statement, I don't know how to be polite. That statement's just made up.
I would disagree, because I think the point of that statement is that there is no research that we can do that will make an international governance regime that does not exist, and an international social cohesion or international framework for human rights that research doesn't make that happen, right? So part of the arguments that even David just mentioned is like, oh, but we do research on governance issues in solar geoengineering. Look, there's all these new papers coming out on the governance issues of solar geoengineering. But doing research on the governance issues of solar geoengineering does not change the governance, our global governance system, right? And I think that's what this statement is saying. That's what Frank is.
It's not what the statement says, though. It might be what's in his head, but it's not what the statement says if you read it.
No, I think it says the research, what you just said, David, you proved his point, because you said, look, we have all this new research that's saying that it won't be that bad. It's even better than we thought. You said quantitatively, the risks are lower. It could be even better. But you're not integrating, when you say that, global governance. And you're assuming you're basing it on models that are just about the physical science, which is excluding the social and governance issues from the equation. So that is exactly what that statement says. And I think it's exactly spot on.
Well, we can leave it to readers to listen to both of us and read what the statement said. I think there's two kinds of claims here. One is that there's no research on governance issues. I think that claim isn't true. Another claim is that research on governance issues will not magically erect a just global governance system. And on that, I 100% agree. And in my practice, I think that the actual academic research on governance can often be a little sterile. And in my experience, the interesting conversations are with people who actually kind of have a hand in the global governance system, people who are involved in it practically. And those people have yet another set of views, which isn't very well represented by me or Jenny or Frank. And those views vary from a view that really supports Jenny's view, which is like, it's hopeless to imagine doing this, to people I've met who've got really practical experience who think it's actually not that hard. Not that it'll be done in some magic, perfect way that we'd want, but it's not that hard to do. I don't know. But I agree with Jenny that the academic research on governance doesn't magically make good governance. But there is a lot of academic research on governance, which is what Frank's statement said.
I think I'm just going to jump in here quick for the journalists. This is a great area for journalists to start to explore, because I do think a lot of the media coverage is about the science and what it can do or what it can't do in the debate and the ethical debate. It's not about, I don't see a lot of journalists, and myself included, I haven't really gotten to write about this much, but about okay, what would governance look like? Who would be in power? Would we want some kind of like UN type system to make this decision? Would this be a decision that the US and China just agree on and all of a sudden we're doing it? I think that would be a really interesting, fascinating, long form article to dig deep into that I personally haven't seen a lot of coverage come out of this. And that's one of the places where, obviously, from watching today, the debate is really trying to figure that out.
Those are good points. We're going to go ahead and move on to the next question. So some African nations and other nations in the global majority have called for a global governance mechanism for non-use of solar radiation management. So this question is directed at you, Jenny. So as someone with experience in the social governance space, what are the main concerns from these nations that you understand in global negotiations on this issue? And what do journalists need to understand about that and better contextualize this for audiences?
Yeah, so I think, again, it's helpful to zoom out and think about climate justice and climate coloniality, which refers to how the rich countries kind of control what happens in the other countries, and including what happens climate-wise, because it's the high consumption patterns and fossil fuel use and other extraction from the rich countries that is causing the climate crisis, yet the people who are most vulnerable are in other countries that are not contributing. So when we come up with this kind of technological fix, which also comes from the global north, and mostly from the United States, and in the world right now, U.S. power, U.S. hegemony, and U.S.-based perspectives are being challenged more and more. And the danger of just doing whatever the U.S. suggests to the rest of the world is becoming more obvious, that it's actually, not in people's best interest necessarily. So I think this speaks to another aspect of this, which is we live in such a financialized world and a corporatized world that people are already trying to make money out of solar geoengineering and in an extractive and exploitative way. there were startup companies have been developed, and they are trying to sell off credits for solar geoengineering. You give us $100, we'll block some sun for a certain amount, and we have no regulation of these kind of companies, and so there's a lot of opportunity for exploitation, and people around the world can see this, and they don't see necessarily a genuine interest in their own well-being and what's best for the different regions of the world. So I think, again, this is where geoengineering reinforces this climate coloniality, that somehow the rich countries are going to come up with some sophisticated technology that will somehow help you help countries that are really in suffering and devastating situations. Yet the money is there. Like, there's money involved too, right? We cannot separate this from finances and huge economic injustices and the financial flows about how power and money are being linked throughout the global economy. And so there's a lot of reason to be skeptical and concerned about efforts by the global north to push this technology on other countries.
Two comments. One, so Jenny said exactly right. The central injustice of climate is that the vast majority of emissions come from rich people in the rich world, and the harms fall most of all on people in hotter countries who are poor, for sure. It is important to say that, of course, that harms would still fall there even if emissions were zero. So that's an important thing to remember, that the cause of the emissions, the moral cause, and there should be retribution payments and so on, the cause is the rich world, or the cause is the historical emissions of the rich world. But even when we eliminate emissions, the change is still there, and it's still falling on the poor world. And I think that's some of the reason that people in the poor world tend to be interested in these technologies to protect them from historical emissions. I agree that it's inequal, but it's not. I think it's not perfect, but science is more global than commerce or money. And after all, the Bala, who published the very first quantitative modeling paper on this, is at Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore. I spent time there last year. There are a growing number of researchers around the world. I agree it's more dominated by research centers that are where climate research is in Europe and the US and China, for sure. But I think that's gradually changing. I think one last thing to say, the set of this question was that some African nations had formally endorsed non-use or opposed. I don't think that's correct. I think some negotiators have, but that's different from a governments taking a national position. I'm not aware of any governments that have taken a national position.
Well, Mexico committed to banning it in response to this make sunsets.
Just to be a little more, yeah, sort of. So I actually talked to Felipe Calderon about this because we were on that overshoot commission thing. So the Mexican Environment Ministry of the Environment, but I don't quite have the name right, excuse me, made a press release saying they were going to do it. They haven't done it. And so just to be there's still a difference between that and an actual national level statement.
Just for real quick context. So Jenny, I just want to make sure, you interrupt me if I'm wrong, but the company you're talking about is called Make Sunsets. They basically are sending small balloons into the stratosphere with a few pounds of sulfur dioxide and asking for money in order to do that. They're considered, I think, by every scientist who's doing this as pretty much a rogue corporate company sort of startup. There's a lot of media about them. There's a lot of discussion about them. It's a very small, tiny operation in terms, but obviously a sign too of where we maybe need some regulation onto how this works, if it's going to move forward and what it would look like.
They're kind of I see those guys as kind of a stunt. I see them more like theater, for better or for worse. I don't think they have they're not technically really trying to do anything serious as far as one can tell. There is a company that actually has a bunch of technical weight behind it called Stardust, an Israeli startup. I don't actually know what they're doing. I don't approve of it. But it's certainly much much more funded, has some very high quality technical people, is what I've heard from people who've talked to them. So if you want to, if there's a company that's serious, it's still very small. It's Stardust. That makes sense.
Yeah. But it also, I was just very quickly just going to say that the fact that there are these companies and the fact that David said he doesn't approve of them and Jeremy said, oh, that's a rogue actor, yet they're there. So like, again, it just is evidence that the scientists have no control over how or when and by whom these technologies will be deployed.
Would you want the scientists to have control? I don't want a world run by technocratic scientists.
No, I don't either. But because you have no control, I think that's why I think it's dangerous not to advocate for more research.
Pardon?
That's exactly why I think it's dangerous. It's to advocate for more research because we have no control.
Got it. So you think it's better that we be secret about the things we found that are potential large public benefits, that we should just shut up about it?
I don't think there's a large public benefit. That's where.
Well, but that's what the evidence. So okay, what are you disputing? The ethics or the evidence?
We do have to. Sorry, guys. We do have to move on to the next question. So there is. We're going to talk about the infrastructure for solar geoengineering. So Wake Smith, climate researcher who lectures at Yale, said it would take about 20 years to make the infrastructure to start deploying SAI. So 20 years. Technically speaking, we have less than 5 years to decarbonize to stay under 1.5, although some people say that that's now out of reach. So given the lengthy amount of time to put in the infrastructure, David, how do proponents of SAI see it fitting into a decarbonization pathway at all?
Well, I see it mostly as independent from decarbonization. So like many complicated human problems, there's many things we need to do. And so in terms of decarbonization, I would say if you asked me total amount of money to spend on climate for getting climate adaptation, I would spend 95% of it on decarbonization and a little bit on beginning to do carbon removal and basically none on solar geo. So I'm not sure I can answer the question about the Wake Smith thing. He and I work quite closely together. I think that figure you quoted is for a giant degree C deployment, which I think would be insane and I would oppose in 20 years. If you want to start subscale, the beginning of deployment at a small scale, like the paper Wake and I published in Technology Reviewer this year, that's something that can be done with existing aircraft much more quickly. So I basically don't see the infrastructure barrier as that serious. I see the big barriers as the ones that Jenny sees, actually, any kind of just or governance and confidence in the science.
Any thoughts from anyone else? Okay. So we're going to move on to our next question. So what exactly is the non-use agreement? It's been described by some researchers like Wake Smith as a non-research agreement, despite the fact that some architects of this agreement say they're not against the research. So does this agreement inhibit research? Why or why not?
So I can describe what it is. It is a collective international effort to try to resist this mainstreaming of this as a public benefit, good idea, among wide representatives of academia and different communities and different experts around the world. And what it speaks to is 5 specific things: a call for no public funding for research, no outdoor experimentation, which has been tried, and there's been widespread resistance for, no patents, no deployment, and no support of solar geoengineering in international institutions. So those are the 5 things that the agreement is calling for. And it speaks to, I mean, it doesn't explicitly say no research, but it is highlighting all of the danger that I've been talking about. And it is a way for this broad collective of people who are really concerned about this, who have no funding, to speak up and to get on media and talk to journalists and have not time to engage on this issue, have a voice to actually elevate these concerns. And it's to be honest, it's been really challenging because the advocates are so well funded, so in such high powerful places, and they are very well connected and very strategic in getting this more and more widely accepted as a appropriate response to the climate crisis. And again, so this non-use agreement is really trying to give voice to all those around the world who are very concerned.
I think it is a no research agreement de facto. I think it was cleverly labeled a no non-use agreement so that more people, more sort of senior scientists would sign it, because there's a broad agreement that it shouldn't be used. But the actual provisions of it, like no international assessment and no government funding, are basically ways to, it feels to me like, make the problems Jenny sees worse. So to me, the big issue is trust in the research. So you've heard two views. Jenny's very sure that the research that I've quoted is really wrong and the risk could be very high. I think she's probably overstating that, but you shouldn't listen to either of us. The way to settle that is to have a high quality international assessment process. And this proposes to block that and to block government funding, which is exactly how we would find out with more confidence what was going on. And I think in that sense, I think it's quite a pernicious thing, or really I'd say a highly overconfident thing. I mean, I think it would be the right point of view if you were like 99.9% sure that kind of 2x2 matrix that I said at the beginning played out in the bad direction. There was just no way this could be useful. And I think it's hard from my perspective to construct that argument, because there's a lot of evidence that people take seriously in some of the leading environmental organizations and leading climate scientists that these things could be useful and could reduce risks to humans and the environment in ways that can't be done otherwise. And there are reports from the United Nations Environment Program that said pretty much exactly the words I just said, as well as reports from IPCC. And so I think that this non-use agreement is trying to block this for reasons that are, it's not surprising they want to avoid assessment, because assessment wouldn't support their position.
Jeremy, do you have anything to add to that?
I mean, just real quickly, I would just say that on the activist side, who are against the sort of field testing research, research in the field, there has been some success in, as I mentioned earlier, in a number of experiments that I've covered that have been delayed or canceled due to activism against that. So I think that there has been some success on that side of it. Obviously, there's a lot of there is funding, there is interest from billionaires, there's interest from the U.S. government on the other side. So, these two, this is kind of how this is sort of playing out now, as we're in the middle of these conversations.
I think it's easy, anything that has interest from billionaires, you should be suspicious of. I know I am. I think what matters is there's interest from the environmental community, from the mainstream environmental community that's serious, and interest from some of the elite environmental science community that have long worked on this problem. And to me, that's the sign that people are really rethinking this.
David, can you just list a couple of the organizations again? Because I don't have them off the top of my head.
Well, so the biggest public one is that Environmental Defense now has a formal public program that will both advocate for research and for global governance and fund research. In my experience, I've talked to lots of environmental organizations, from Friends of the Earth to Natural Resource Defense Council to huge laundry, the Sierra Club, et cetera. And what you see in almost all those orgs are real debates inside and you'll see mostly those organizations don't have strong negative positions out there. Like actually Sierra has a very reasonable position that came out recently. And that's because I think they see the kind of environmental benefits that I do coming from an environmental point of view. One way to think about it is there's lots of ways that we may be able to protect humans through adaptive systems, but it's really hard to protect bits of the natural world we care about by things other than doing this. Essentially, if you want the world to be cooler than it is now or at any time where you make a decision, it's just a fact of science that you have to do either solar geoengineering or carbon removal. And if the world is hot enough to actually damage some of the natural environment that many of us love, there's a good reason to take these things seriously.
We do need to move on to our next question. Just as a journalist, I would encourage folks who are interested in covering the opinions of environmental organizations to reach out to them directly to get their opinion from them. But so global governance of this technology seems to be quite limited. So what are the current global policies in place to prevent deployment, either with or without research, that journalists should take note of? Of the ones in consideration or under development, are any of them progressing forward? Why or why not?
None, other than customary international law, which basically says that one nation shall not do something that has significant transboundary harm to some other nation, which is actually a real principle that has some weight in international law, and has been tested in international court, most famously in a case between Canada, my country, that was polluting with sulfur, the United States, the trial smelter case. So I think, but other than that, there's nothing. On the other hand, that's kind of standard in international law. So we don't typically have international law until late in the game when there are big problems. I'm not saying that's the way I'd like it to be. That's just descriptive. And it's generally true for all sorts of emerging technologies with potentially good and harmful outcomes that we don't have international agreements before the technologies emerge.
Yeah, I would just add that we don't have effective global governance in this world. We can see right now with what's happening in the Middle East that and what has been happening in Gaza and the West Bank is that some people's lives are not protected under international law. International law is not applied when certain powerful countries choose not to. And so I think the same applies to this. We cannot expect, or we don't live in a world where we can expect that we will ever have a global governance system that could manage this technology in a way that is that would bring benefits to humanity.
That's an amazing statement. So, like, what level of confident knowledge about all the possible futures, all the ways international law and society could develop, and then all the ways this could go, that says it's like impossible to ever do it in a way that the international system could ever deliver broad benefits to humanity? I mean, maybe you're right, but it's a pretty strong statement. To me, it demands a level of ability to foresee the way the international world will evolve that is certainly beyond me. I think it is important to say that while there's lots of injustice, I probably share Jenny's views about what's happening in the Middle East. There is also a way in which power has diffused away from nation states significantly in the last 30 years, and lots of examples where, in a way that's kind of muddling through, there is more international law, including international dispute settlement mechanisms that have worked. It's not the way I would want it to be, but it's also not nothing. International law is a hard thing, and it's building up piece by piece, but there are lots of examples. There are both examples in regions where EU really has some level of law that transcends the national, and there's ways in which it's true here. None of them are great. This is a hard problem. But it's not as if there's nothing. There really are disputes that do get settled.
I think we could just look at the climate negotiations for the past 30 years and see how ineffective they are. As I said, more fossil fuels than ever, and the climate crisis getting worse and worse every single year. So,
well, climate crisis will get worse whenever fossil fuel emissions are above zero. So but I do think that you can look at the glass half full or half empty. I did wish, I fought for much more action. But it's also true that there really is action. I mean, there are in lots of places of the world real policies that are driving renewables in and starting to drive fossil out. And you can see the curve bending, not as fast as we wanted, but it's not nothing.
So we're going to move on to our final question here. So what questions do you wish more journalists in general were asking about geoengineering that aren't getting asked? How do you feel the media is doing overall with the coverage of this topic? How can we, for lack of a more technical term, do better?
One is to separate the two questions. So I think Jenny is implying that, the world will not be governed beautifully anytime soon. It may, I think it's bending towards justice and getting better. Maybe she doesn't, I don't know. But I think one way to separate them is to say, let's assume bad intentions and power and ugliness. How much can this be abused in practice? Really trying to think it through. So let's assume we have a really ugly world and the US wants to dominate, to make itself better and make somewhere else worse. To what extent can this technology be used for that? Putting that in comparison to the sort of leverage to other technologies. Because part of the reason I think I see it differently from Jenny is actually not that I see a world of all good intentions and no power. I see really ugly power. I see this as being, for some systematic reasons, harder to misuse than some other things that we already have, not because of happy good intentions, but because of just functional things about the way this works.
Yeah, so I guess I wish that journalists would focus more on climate justice, which is a paradigm shift. It's moving away from this technological climate isolationist, climate is a problem that we have to think about in greenhouse gas emissions and temperature increase, and narrowly focusing on decarbonization and this kind of a technical approach. I think we need to focus on a much more holistic and transformative lens. There's no incremental. It's not about, oh, we're making progress or we're not. It's like we need big systemic structural change. And that's what climate justice is about. It's a paradigm shift. It's not just allowing things to muddle through and keep, oh, maybe we're doing a little better. We need big change. It's too late for anything else. And what I see and what I wish journalists would cover more is that geoengineering is reinforcing the status quo because it allows people to perceive that we don't need big transformative change and that we can come up with something that will somehow, have some benefits without that. And I think the other, in terms of different perspectives, I wish the journalists would cover more Indigenous people's perspectives, feminist perspectives, climate justice perspectives, and not so much of the science, because the science, as we just talked about, doesn't include these kinds of governance, equity, financial power issues, right? It just, they're not in the models. It's not in the models. So that's what's missing in a lot of the coverage. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to do better and to, again, move the climate coverage conversation to bigger global change, focusing on how do we phase out fossil fuels? Why are we still coming into the next COP with the fossil fuel companies, the fossil fuel countries dominating again? Like, why are we okay with that? Why do we sit back and be like, oh, here we go again? I don't think it's acceptable. And I don't think doing more research that makes it seem, oh, it's just normal, is helpful. So I think this is where I think there's a lot of opportunity for journalists to expand their climate coverage to much more broad, bigger picture transformative change. That's where we are. We're in a poly crisis. Every year, things are getting worse, not just on climate, on so many things. And if we want to have a better future, we need bigger structural changes.
Jeremy, do you have anything to add to that?
I think as a journalist, it's best for me just to listen at that point. I mean, I have a lot of thoughts, a lot of emotions, but I think that it's important for me to listen to both of, I think, very important this conversation. So I'm going to just leave myself on that.
No worries. We have time for a couple of quick audience questions. So this one is from Elizabeth. She is asking, what is the correlation between greenwashing and geoengineering? And more importantly, she's asking, how can journalists ensure their reporting avoids greenwashing to their audiences?
Well, I can speak to that in that we know, again, after more than 30 years trying to address climate change and knowing what's causing climate change. And we know that all the fossil fuel companies and other powerful interests that don't want change, don't want the structural transformative change that is necessary to phase out fossil fuels, to take away that power, are promoting these kinds of technical fixes. I know Jeremy mentioned it's not necessarily that you can make an explicit connection, but I think it is worth acknowledging that it's pretty powerful interests and powerful countries, right, that are promoting these ideas of geoengineering. So as a kind of, we think we're taking this climate crisis, climate change as a serious issue. So I think there is a risk of being too optimistic, I guess. And I think that's how greenwashing works, is like, we're doing something, we're doing this, therefore, we're taking it seriously, right? That's kind of what greenwashing is all about, saying we're doing some small step, taking the issue seriously, but then actually not really changing what were the society or the priorities or the structures and systems that are perpetuating the problem. So to my mind, without a critical view of geoengineering, the coverage can be contributing to that.
I think it can be. I don't see that happening a lot in practice. I see a really strong use of carbon removal in a kind of greenwashing mode by fossil fuel companies and fossil-rich nations that try and use it as a de facto excuse for business as usual. I don't in practice see that much for solar geoengineering, but I think it will happen because self-interest is a powerful thing.
All right. Well, that is about all the time that we have for. So I just want to say thank you to our panelists for joining us for this this lively discussion. If you want to learn more about the topic of geoengineering or read Jeremy Hance's reporting on the topic, you can find information that will be hyperlinked in the final upload of this webinar, as well as information regarding our panelists' work. So if you missed any of this webinar, it will be published on our YouTube channel in roughly 24 to 48 hours, along with timestamps and resources. And you'll receive a link to this video along with the survey that we send, and it'll be published on our blog at mongabay.org. So if you want to keep a closer eye on our webinar series and follow along with what we're working on, I highly recommend that you subscribe to our webinar newsletter community, which you can do by going to mongabay.com and clicking on the button in the upper right-hand corner of the page. But I do recommend that you follow us here on YouTube, where you can also get updates via our accounts on LinkedIn, Threads, Mastodon, and Blue Sky, where we also post announcements. Thanks for joining us on this webinar, and we will see you on the next one.